Hello, everybody, and welcome to this first installment from Boston Blockchain Week 2025. In this video, you're going to be watching the initial fireside chat that kind of kicked it all off. It's going to be a chat between Eleanor Terrett, the host of Crypto in America, and Derek Yo, the CEO of Moonbeam. Give it a listen, and I'll see you on the other side.
Yes, I've been building software companies in Boston like my whole career, since the 90s. Notably, the Boston company maybe knows a company called Fuse. Some of the co-founders there is a little bit pretty significant size in the Boston area.
Cloud communication?
It's a cloud communication, so mostly like not a blockchain, like most of my career, but obviously starting in 2019 in the blockchain space. We founded a project called Moonbeam, which is a medium out of everything from the Coconut Network, and from there, a lot of other Web3 related initiatives.
Cool. When you think about Web 2 and obviously working in constructing Web3 infrastructure now, what are the biggest differences? And I guess what are some of can you bring initiatives that you learned from Web 2 into building Web3 infrastructure, or anything that you can learn and sort of translate? Does that even translate?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's changed over time, right? I mean, I was reflecting on this earlier that we're in a moment now where I think a lot of just traditional company building ideas and kind of requirements are coming to the fore again, right? But when it comes to basics of company building, having doing a great job recruiting, Web3 has always tended towards this tech-heavy focus. I think we're in a moment now where that's shifting back. People understand that you need to have a great company. It's not enough to have just tech, right? You need great marketing, great go-to-market, and BD. And so I think a lot of those lessons were ones that were quite helpful, having been like a previous tech entrepreneur coming into Web3, to have that kind of outlook versus this, hey, build the tech and, people will come.
Yeah. And then from comms, or I guess like tech comms, how did you get into crypto specifically? I believe that your partner at Fuse was an early starter at Algorand.
That's right. So my co-founder. So my co-founder from Fuse, a guy named Steve Coquinos, so worked with him for many years, and then he left to become the CEO, the original CEO of the project Algorand, which is one of the big Boston blockchain projects on one, and that's really what got me into the mission. So that was back in 2018 or so. So that's happened in 2017, 2018.
And then you started Moonbeam.
So basically started working on the project Moonbeam, and obviously that was diving into like both feet first, because I was on blockchain, building an Ethereum implementation, like using another technology substrate, and all of the things that go along with like creating a project, right? So that's building community, understanding all these DeFi and other use cases, and quite a bit of like learning through that process.
And from a founder's perspective, when you're building these Web3 infrastructures, what makes an interface usable but also actually enjoyable for a user to use, right? I mean, I think a lot of the problem in Web3 has been sort of these user interface and how it's a bit clunky, maybe a little bit just difficult to get comfortable with. How do you go about, especially as someone who's been forefront of this, but also someone who comes from a tech background and seeing the beginning and the end of this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because usability, I would say, is at the heart of adoption, right? People are always saying, I need more users, or how do I get more users? And a lot of it does come down to the UX and usability you're able to offer. And I think there's been, historically a pretty big tension point in building Web3 products where kind of decentralization and usability can, are sometimes at odds with each other, right? So you have a choice in the road, you're like, okay, well, if I do this is kind of making it maximally decentralized, but maybe there's a trade-off against like usability. And I think you see it, right? In our space, it tends to be that decentralized products are the ones that have the most users, right? And say, we're able to offer the best user experience. I think that's changing now, though, right? We're in an interesting moment now where, I think people are adopting a more pragmatic mindset, right? So, even if you have, let's say, a third-party limit, I think people are much more willing these days to say, hey, let's maybe, if it's okay to be in a hybrid state, like maybe there's certain components that are centralized, but just so yes, there's some trust assumptions there, but we're able to make like a faster, better user experience, but that's worth it. And I think an example like hyperliquid, for example, right? Or it falls in this category. So, I mean, to me, that's like progress that like people are having this much more pragmatic mindset. You're not saying, hey, like it's kind of all or nothing. We either are decentralized or not at all, and like we're gonna live or die on that hill. That's not that helpful when you're trying to just get users, right? And many of them don't really care that much about the degree of decentralization on the platform. And so, just having this pragmatic mindset, and that's what very important to me in like building products in regular like use spaces. Just the attention and detail that goes into, building great user experience. That takes like takes a lot of energy and effort. And so, if you're going to make a product that's competitive, like with these other centralized solutions, you have to have that kind of mindset. And I just don't think, in general, users aren't willing to give up on usability, for these principles, like centralization. So, we're this pragmatic mindset these days, I think, is actually healthy and good.
What applications would you say have really good usability right now? I guess aside from pragmatic, you just mentioned. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about it, it's UX, but it's also a feature sets, right? So, I mean, just from the news last week, you have this announcement Tempo, right? The new kind of L1, let's try the paradigm of it. But they were just tweeting out some of the features there. And you can see that some of the features are, they are not the features necessarily that, like, if you're kind of a decentralization maximalist, like you'd be talking about, right? But they're pragmatic. So it's things like, how do I prioritize payments that don't get solved by, other use cases that can change? So it's a very problem. How can I offer compliance features, right? For example, with like account CT frozen, maybe a rollback set. And so this to me is again a sign that you're entering into a more mature stage where there's practical requirements that these big companies have that they're just not going to use the technology unless they can meet their requirements. And so, to me, it can be a divisive point because people are saying, hey, like I got into the space for different reasons, like this doesn't feel good. I think this is what adoption looks like. This is what like making mainstream products looks like. And you have to be able to meet the requirements to get these big players to move. So,
that's a great point of what's for actually later in the conversation. Let's go now. Crypto, how's it matured? I mean, you've been in space a long time now. I think Congress has been making some laws, right? We're seeing the Trump administration warm to the sector. I think it is, the SEC now has sort of taken on the approach that, okay, crypto is good. It's not this pariah, not this pariah sector anymore. AI is also a complement to crypto. Do you think it's mature enough where we can perhaps integrate this into the wider financial system now, and it's grown up enough where maybe in the past all those scandals with FTX and Free Arrows and everything that we saw in crypto winter of 2022, are we past that?
I think so. I would say so. I mean, for me, the moment right now, obviously, there's a lot of interesting traction at this intersection of TradFi and NFT. I see that again as like a healthy thing. This mindset of practicality. What do I need to do to build a product that is, as good or better than existing companies out there? These are all like signs of maturation. The fact that these big players with big distribution, that's going to open the door to larger distribution. So it's, you have some like Robin Hoods starting a chain. That is like inherently different than like a startup, like a Web3 David startup. They have like a very subscribe to a lot of other players. And in fact, I think for Boston, it's like a good thing as well. Boston is well positioned for this kind of thing, given its roots, having a lot of these very companies like that. Web3 really good.
Like a state.
Right? I mean, I talked about adaptability, was talking about how you pay Bitcoin in their cafeteria like 10 years ago. It's like good on this for all the time.
Yeah. From a founder's perspective, from your personal perspective, how has anything changed, in your business? Have you had any conversations with the SEC? Has anything changed in the last year at Unisong?
Yeah, I mean, on the kind of the regulatory landscape and the changes there, and the thing that I think is most important is that kind of the signal that like, hey, it's okay to be a Web3 concept, right? And for a long time, if you're a U.S. person, building a Web3 project, I think that some of those events you're talking about, that became, more difficult, something even like the bench you're talking about, right? And so I think what it led to is basically a dearth of like good quality founders that were US kids, which is weird because if you look at other tech sectors, other areas, other software areas, it's dominated by US founders. And so I think that makes me bullish for the future. If you looked at, like, for example, venture capital verticals last year, there was mapping out where founders were from that was starting up through projects, and the majority was from like Europe or Asia. Well, that's not like normal. Let's say that in most other cases, it would be led by like North American American entrepreneurs. So I think that it takes time though, right? So like the lift for Dale, new founders come up with ideas. They realize, hey, like Web3 makes sense. It's technology to use my solution, and I expect that's like happening now, right? There's like more US-based founders that are doing it now, so we'll see that like, as a tailwind going into next year.
Do you think Wall Street's going to pull that slowness of crypto kind of lagging in the US? Do you think Wall Street's going to pull that into the future a little bit? Maybe pull it up into the same level of Europe and Asia?
I mean, I just think that we're, when the opportunity is there, like, we're enterprising people, right? There'll be founders that will step in to fill that. And I think you can see now all the activities happening. The opportunities there, people are realizing, again, from this pragmatic mindset, like, where is it that Web3 makes sense? Where is it that I can apply this technology in a way that makes for better problems? Mm-hmm. Obviously, like right now, stablecoins would be like one area. I think that's like pretty much conventionalism now. You have to go into the equity departments or strategy departments of these big banks and places. It's just like it's objectively better, compared to like legacy tech stacks.
Mm-hmm. And then Boston specifically, did you see any exiting founders or what rebuild here? Or was it largely sort of, okay, we're going to build, we're just going to build?
I guess Boston has been perhaps influenced by like the financial institutions so it's had this institutional bent always.
Yeah.
There are some, there obviously are like teams like what we have here, but they're probably less than like more Cisco. But it's like I think there is a scene here. There are definitely like other a lot of founders like protocol founders like they're I'd say that it's this institutional vibe is a little bit the same.
Yeah. All right, let's switch gears. I want to get into sort of the venture side of your life as well. You've built a lot of companies. You've also had a hand in building up a lot of companies as well. What goes into those decisions for you personally? When you see a company and you think, okay, yes, this is a company I want to incubate and see through it to the end. I guess maybe two things that you say, this is why.
I'll answer two ways. One are kind of the obvious answers. It's true of any company building, right? We need to have a great market, like some of the great team and other things. But there are some Web3 specific things I want to mention. And actually, before I go there, I'd say that this advice I often give is around making sure to start with like the customer and work your way backwards, right? So there's a lot of enthusiastic Web3 founders I talk to or help advise. Many of them are often starting with tech first and saying, hey, there's this, like the DK technology is amazing, like I'm going to build this tech. But in my experience, it's much, much better if you start with like the customer and the problem they're having first and work backwards to the tech solution. So that's a frequent point of advice. Giving like a young founders or people starting new things. And I'd say in Web3 though, the question that we often ask ourselves at Moonbeam is one of the things we do is in venture studio, projects, incubating projects. And the question is like, where does Web3 make sense, right? And often it's kind of shoehorned in, maybe there's interest in hey, let's launch a token, let's shoehorn this thing in, but it doesn't really make sense. And I think the market's in a state now where that's going to quickly get flushed out. Right? So you're not going to make it very far. If it isn't truly making sense, you're not actually getting real customer traction. It's organic. It's only so far that we're taking these days. And there's a few patterns that we've found that I think are relevant. Obviously, there's this payments area. That's one thing. But multi-sided marketplaces, so using Web3 as a kind of coordination mechanism for match the size of the market, and that's another idea that's quite solid. And the DPN is effectively that formulation of Web3, and kind of this idea of verifiability, right? So being able to publicly verify different kinds of actions. That's we'll talk about it later, I think. But about AI, that's pretty crucial area of research for us.
Let's go to AI. I think for at least this past year, maybe even two, AI in the intersection of blockchain was a big buzzword, right? Do you still feel like it's that way? Was it maybe overhyped for a little bit? Is it still that way?
Yeah, I mean, kind of this first wave of like influencer agents, I'd say in some ways was overhyped and then and then fell out of favor. But I mean, to me, so just for context, we have an AI lab at Moonbeam, people spend quite a bit of time working in the AI sector, we're learning that set of tools and skills to be able to apply to new ventures. And look, I mean, AI agents, they are going to change the way things work. They already are changing the way we operate. So even the software development we do is now heavily using AI agents, to automate many different things that used to be manual. And I'd say we're in a moment right now where a lot of that experimentation automation is happening internally in companies, but it's soon going to evolve to the point where there is an external interactions between companies, between AI agents, and that's I think an exciting opportunity. That's a place where the blockchain actually has some really good things to offer. So if you're inside the company, well, you can trust kind of the actions of the agents are also agents that are working for you, right? Who are actually working for you. It becomes different when you're not in control of the agents, right? You're interacting with other agents over the internet. Then that's a different kind of mindset, right? That's more of like a business mindset of, hey, I think I'm partners, does this make sense? You don't really contract with them or mitigate my risks. It's a different set of considerations there.
So do you see a future where AI is AI is building its own blockchain, or is it always going to be sort of AI built on top of blockchains?
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like there's endless possibilities, right? When it comes to AI, you can think of anything.
They're complementary technologies, but to put kind of AI computation directly on a blockchain, it doesn't work for a lot of reasons, right? It's very computationally expensive. Blockchains are quite, they have a lot of great features, but computational throughput is not one of those features, so they're quite slow. So the idea is to find complementary ways those two technologies work together. Mm-hmm. So as an example, I think it was mentioned before here in the previous talks. You get this area of deploying AI agents to kind of be your agent to perform on-chain actions. That's a pretty fruitful area. So we are working with a number of different customers that pursuing projects in this area. There's a lot of DeFi oriented agents these days, right? And the idea is pretty simple of, hey, instead of a human interacting directly with these complex DeFi protocols, let's create an agent that understands how to interact with those DeFi protocols. And now as a user, I can interact with the agent in a much simpler way, right? I say, hey, here's the goal I have, here's the kinds of outcomes I want, here's my risk tolerances. And the agent will translate those high-level intents into low-level actions on the blockchain. So you're kind of using the AI as an abstraction layer to make it easier to work with blockchains. We're circling back to the point about how do you make this work together. Yeah, it's what they do.
And all your venture products, as the right percentage of them, would you say are focused on AI?
Pretty much all of them. Yeah, it's pretty much all of them. So I think the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about are, what kinds of decentralized infrastructure are genuinely useful to agents, and on the forward vision of something I've heard people call the agent economy, right? So it's once there's agents that are interacting with each other across the internet, across company boundaries, I'm a firm believer that's going to be a massive, right? A lot of economic activities are going to move to that way. And yes, the question is then what kinds of infrastructure do those agents need? I think that's a very, very big option.
It's mind-blowing.
It's happening now, right?
I know. It's wild. I'm going to switch gears as well to talk about what's going on with interoperability on chain, because with Moonbeam, that's kind of the reason you launched Moonbeam, right? Was to be able to go between chains and have an EVM compatible chain on the coin market. I think for a long time the mantra in crypto is the future is interoperability. Do you still see that as the future? Is the future still multi-chain? Even though we talked about this before going on stage, there is some consolidation going on.
Yeah.
What's your thought?
Yeah, I can answer that question as both yes and no. So the nuance is this, but there's really like strong consolidation happening now. I think of it in terms of not just chains, but of tech stacks, right? So when it comes to tech stacks, and by tech stack, I mean things like EM tech stack, this core on Ethereum mainnet, and let's say take Solana, right? Solana's SVM, those are tech stacks. There's major consolidation already that's happening. Right? So I would say that people are generally choosing either EM or Solana. I'll say like that's the majority of like new projects who can have this choice. With larger projects choosing both and saying, "Yeah, I'm going to cover both markets." And to me, that's that rhymes with a lot of like history of technology. Right? There's only so many tech platforms in a given market to support. So if you look at mobile, for example, there was once many platforms. Well, now there's effectively two. And the reason is simple. If you're like a vendor trying to support users on a mobile platform, there's only so many platforms you can support. Right? Two is pretty much the limit where it's reasonable to ask a company to create conversions for software. And so same thing playing out like here in the blockchain space where I think it's already kind of clear to me that it's EVM and SVM are effectively two platforms. Now the nuances within that, though, obviously like EVM is not just one chain, there's many chains that are in EVM. And you can see from these recent announcements we just talked about that a lot of these new players want to control the tech stack, their deployment end to end. So they're either on L1s in some cases, not even L2s. But like, so I think that's going to continue. But like with this EVM program, it's very, very difficult to launch a new tech stack that has like a whole ecosystem of dev tools, other things around it. So I think that shift is kind of set at this point. So we're looking at these two as the main tech stack.
I was listening to a podcast actually with the local Wall Streets in 2022, so 3 years ago now. And I remember he said, "I don't think interoperability is old area." And he said that's a fair assessment. You guys were talking about how at the time, obviously this was around TX time and crypto winter, but he was characterizing interoperability for a bunch of the security lapses that we didn't see at the time. Do you think those are, for the most part, getting fixed? Are we seeing the security lapses around interoperability, or is it a little bit better these days?
I mean, from my perspective, actually, like the number of like security incidents, like smart contract levels, have gotten like dramatically better. So I think that's the result of better tools, better like experience like from the developer side, like more mature auditing, like ecosystems. It's not to say they don't happen, but the frequency of which are happening is definitely less. Demonstrably, like if you compare now versus 3-4 years ago. But yeah, on this cross-chain thing, like so, I think the reality is, we're going to be like there's going to be ever more chains, even if they're consolidated from a tech stack perspective. And the question is, okay, like, well, what does that mean for the user experience? And here, like, I'd say take AI agents, right? So one vector I see for creating abstraction is, insofar as you're delegating what you want to do to an AI agent, it can in turn connect to many different blockchains to satisfy that request. So that's like, a vector where you're kind of, you're creating a cross-chain like scenario, or you're kind of abstracting away like cross-chain complexities. You're doing so through an AI agent. And there is some trust assumption happening there, but that's a very likely path that I see like to get traction or given the utility of these agents, right? How much they're able to do.
Do you think that might contribute to maybe one day in the future we just aren't going to really know what chain we're interacting on and transacting on? It might just kind of blend, maybe sort of like cloud infrastructure these days. It kind of just all depends. Gravy at the end of the day.
Potentially, and I think the trick is that the security trust assumptions tend to not be the same across different chains, or even across even if you're on Ethereum, different L2s have different security assumptions. So that's the trick where they're not all the same. So thus, if you're executing different kinds of cross-chain actions, you get a different risk profile. You can kind of sum the risks across the different hooks that you're doing. But on the other hand, I think this is the kind of task that AI agents are pretty good at, right? So if it understands kind of the landscape, the risk landscape, it can kind of have an internal risk model that's like computing the level of risk across these different groups. So that's the area I think, and that's how what we're doing these days. On the agents as they get more sophisticated and factor in more dimensions into the analysis.
So you're bullish on AI, where we are in the AI cycle right now?
I mean, it's hard to find someone where they're not like starting to use these tools more and more and more in their daily life.
Yeah. What about Web3 in general? I mean, it's kind of like if you were to describe Web3, like where we are, sort of in the, I guess, the early phase, the mid phase, the late phase.
I mean, to me, as I was mentioning at the beginning, I think we're at like a maturation stage right now. So a lot of that early, early idealism, I think, is like, a little bit being challenged. You have like new players coming in that are actively minded, right? They're like, hey, I'm trying to build a product, so I have all these users, like, where is it that, Web3 makes sense for certain use cases, and use that as a technology. That's healthy in my opinion, though. I think that like when it comes to projects, right, there's like different kind of questions you get from VCs that are trying to break these down, right? I mean, I can tell you back in 2019, 2020, there wasn't, there was, hey, is the team good? Does it make sense? And the kind of question you get now is like, okay, who are your customers? Like, what revenue do you have? Like, I was talking to like a founder the other day who was kind of lamenting to me and said, oh, he's like, hey, this question, it's like, welcome to the real world. This is like what it's like to just build an actual product, like, and that's what experience you have if you're going to raise money to build like a company in like some other space. So to me, that's healthy and that's happening pretty good. That's the bar is employees, and that's what we need.
And what advice would you give to young builders and founders maybe who are sitting here in this audience today who want to build something like a Moonbeam or a Moonsong that following the same path that you did in 2019, but honestly, it's a little bit different in 2025. What would you say to that?
I mean, to me, the principles kind of stay the same. Like I mentioned it before. I mean, to me, the most important piece of advice is, when you're trying to figure out what to build, start with like the customer and understanding their problem, like working way backwards to like what the solution is to look like. I think with that alone, that's probably the most common kind of challenge I see is people start with the technical side of it, which is great. I'm excited about the tech, but then they're trying to like map that tech back to like customers and problems. Sometimes more successfully, sometimes not successfully. And like I think you just need to start with the customer and the problem, and obviously like the market. Right? It's something that's going to be a big market. It's very hard to change those things. And usually the tech solution will really.
All right, I have to ask you this because this was on our little rundown of the agenda. But what does the mainstream media get wrong when it comes to blockchain? And I want to ask you this because I used to be part of the mainstream media, so I find this fascinating. If you want to ask the mainstream media, go right ahead. So what does it get wrong still? When it decides to cover it, I guess.
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't feel like I don't have like. I think there's still this hangover, right, from like all the problems that happened like from 22 and then onwards, and so I use my parents as witnesses, right? They're like pretty unplugged in people when it comes to this, and their memories and their takes are often just a result of big events they saw years ago, and so this is where I think in some ways making Web3 like kind of boring like is good enough, right? We want it to be just like the right tool for the job in all these different cases, and just like using that tool more, and then it becomes boring, but it becomes big and better.
What news sources do you use for your crypto news? Curious.
Podcasts.
That's good.
I'll start with yours.
All right, give it up for Derek, everybody. Thank you so much.
So what did you think about that first fireside chat from Boston Blockchain Week 2025? Not bad, huh? There's more good stuff coming. Stay tuned. And I'm going to put it in an entire playlist for you so you can check that whole playlist out right here. I will see you there.